Welcome to the Football Journey Podcast. I am your host, Derek Ware. Hey, in the past episodes, we've been discussing this idea, this topic of what if conventional wisdom is wrong. We interviewed Zach Kelly. He's the son of Kevin Kelly, the coach who never punts, and Zach Kelly tore his ACL just days, weeks before the season started. He had surgery. He came back 57 days later and ended up having 1,500 yards receiving that same season and won the state championship. How did he do it? Well, he assumed that conventional wisdom was wrong and did the research and found a better way to recover from ACL surgery. I would recommend that anybody who has ever had any injuries go look at that podcast. And today, we're talking about something else that is really inspiring, awe-inspiring to me. Here's the thing. You look at yourself. We all look at ourselves. We look at others, and sometimes we come to the conclusion of, you know what? I could have never been Mozart. I could have never been Einstein. I could have never been Steph Curry. It was not in my genes. It wasn't possible for me. Or you see kids and you say that to them, and the question is, what if that line of thinking, what if that conventional wisdom is short-sighted? What if our genes, our DNA, is way more complicated than that? What if there's more to it? What if the conventional wisdom is wrong? Well, today we're talking to national best-selling author David Shenk. He has written an incredible book called The Genius in All of Us, and he has the update. He has what science can tell us about our DNA, about our genes, and about what is possible and who we can become and how it works. It's something that was inspiring to me, this idea that there might be still some meat left on the bone. We might not be fully reaching our potential because how do you really know what potential is until you have applied extraordinary circumstances? And he gives us some really good insight on that. All right, well, here he is. David Shenk, the best-selling author of the book, The Genius in All of Us. Throughout your book, you have this theme of talent is not a thing, it's a process. And kind of explain, what does that mean? Talent is not a thing, it's a process.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having me on. This is an honor for me. One of my dreams when I wrote the book was that it would really be taken up in a serious way by the coaching community, because obviously that's one of the important parts of our culture and our lives where kids, get to pursue their abilities and their dreams and ask all these kind of elemental questions about what they can do and how far they can go. So this is I've been waiting for some coaches and stuff. I've had lots of cool conversations, but it's really cool that you're focused straight in this. So what do I mean by talent is not a thing but a process? We have been raised to talk about talent as something that you have or you don't have. The very word talent and the way it's talked about as though you're discovering your talent, or someone has a great talent in football but not a lot of talent in music. And isn't that person lucky to have had this talent and to been able to kind of put a little polish on it? We think of talent as something that in some way you're born with. We recognize, of course, that everything takes hard work too. No one thinks that anyone is just born being a great dancer or football player or whatever. But the way we talk about talent is you got to have that. If you have any chance of being really good at something, you got to have that certain something inside you to start in whatever domain you're going to pursue. And if you're lucky enough to have that, then what you need is a good coach and a good set of parents and the resources and the time and the perseverance and all that stuff to kind of polish off what you have. And in my research, which really brings together lots of different threads from science, I just think that's not as far as I can tell, there's just no truth to that. As far as I can tell, talent and intelligence are really a collection, a massive collection of lots and lots of different skills that you pick up in your lifetime. And of course, you know, some people are able to pick up more, and some people are able to pick up less. And of course, we're all different human beings, and we have different genetics and things like that. So I'm not claiming that everyone is equal, everyone has exactly the same potential or anything, but the more you learn about how genes work, about how people develop these great abilities, about when you look into the lives of extraordinary achievers in music and art and athletics and academics, et cetera, you just see the same story over and over again. If you look real closely about how is this developmental thing, how it started, with this tiny little interest and then this tiny little skill that got nurtured, and then something built on top of that and built on top of that, and lo and behold, you end up with these just extraordinary achievers. So that's a long answer to your excellent short question.
That is awesome. Okay, so this idea that you're saying that IQ is not something that is fixed, but it's something that changes. And you're saying that IQ is not just one thing, but it's really a group of a lot of things all combined. If somebody is good at math, that's a lot of different skills that they've all put together and that they use. It's not necessarily a gene that you're born with. Is that correct?
Absolutely. In fact, IQ is a great example of this. The very notion of IQ, the name IQ and the notion of it was invented by a French philosopher and teacher and scientist named Alfred Binet. About 120, 30 years ago, something like that, late 19th century. And his whole thing was, he had this notion. I don't know how radical it was at the time, but he had this notion that intelligence was the skills that you developed in your lifetime. And obviously, school is a big part of that. So he had this notion that he wanted to figure out how to make schools more effective. And he thought, what we need to do is develop this kind of big test of intelligence, meaning intelligence to him meant all these, skills that make you intelligent, or that you either have or you don't have. And there's all these different ways of being intelligent. Intelligence is, as I think sure everyone listening knows by now, is not just one thing. It's all these different ways of thinking abstractly, communicating, using words and abstract notions, and etc. So as they were learning about all these different types of intelligence way back when, Binet wanted to come up with a universal test that teachers could give kids to show what they had learned and what they hadn't learned. The skills, not necessarily the particular knowledge, but the skills of thinking that they had picked up and they hadn't picked up. So that when you looked at the deficits, a teacher could say, oh, we need to spend more time and figure out a way to teach you to pick up these basic skills that you haven't picked up yet. And we're not as worried with these other skills, which obviously the test shows you're doing well in. So, the funny thing happened on the way to the forum. The IQ test got picked up in the United States about 100 years ago by a whole set of these real dogmatic thinkers who thought 100% differently from Binet, and were absolutely convinced that everything about intelligence and talent had to do with your innate being. You're either born with it or you weren't born with it. And they were really into sorting people into classes of talent and intelligence, thinking, okay, we need to use this test, which someone else has invented, to figure out who should be in the academic class and who should become doctors, who should become the low laborers, who don't need the high intelligence.
Yeah.
And so they used the test that way, and they started this notion, which is a very effective notion. It's very, very powerful, because for 100 years we've been thinking about IQ in this wrong way, as this thing that just kind of that reveals who you are and how much how much intelligence you have kind of baked into your genetics and your brain from from the moment you're born. And even very recently, we've heard our president, Donald Trump, talking about the IQ that he was born with, and how he's lucky to be born with this giant IQ. And that's just not true. And we can talk about, how I'm certain that that's not true, but it's every bit of science that goes into this, when you look closely, shows that that's just not what IQ is. It's really a collection of skills that you do or you do not develop over time.
That's crazy, and that's interesting that you bring up that school system, and sometimes, I'm a school teacher as well. I coach football. I'm the offensive coordinator at Princeton High School, and I teach English there. And my son, my oldest son, I have 3 kids. My oldest son, Jericho, he is in the 1st grade, and last year while he was in kindergarten, he qualified for the Gifted and Talented program. This program where they test the kids, and I think you gotta pass this test and be in the top 2%, and then you get moved into this Gifted and Talented group. They call it Alpha Kids, and I was excited and proud for my son to be able to do that. But just the title of Gifted and Talented makes it sound like it is something that is given, a gift that you were born with, and not something that is earned. And, my wife and I, we're both educators, and we've spent a lot of time, just from reading your book, David, I learned that our kids have incredible potential. And so we, when he was very young, invested in him, and we invest in all of our kids in learning and teaching them. And so it's like, here he has spent a long time studying these things, and now he does well on this test, and everyone calls it a gift or a talent that was just given to him, and they discount the work that he put in to earn that gift. Have you looked at how schools structure that at all, or how does that relate into your research?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm really, what you're saying is really resonating with me, because I absolutely despise the word gifted. I think people will understand from what I've already said, and that I agree with you 100% that it's dead wrong, and it also sends the wrong message. And as you started to say, the repercussions of hearing that message, that these skills, these abilities that people are identifying in you, did not come from anything you did or any part of your life. It's just something that you're lucky to have. That's a really terrible message to send, and I'll tell you why. The secret to, and you already know this, I'm sure that everything I'm saying tonight is something that you already know, just in your work in education and in coaching, but to kind of put my own little geeky, writerly spin on it, the secret to achieving great things in any domain in your life is to push past your current abilities and to figure out a way to become comfortable with taking risks and failing, and then kind of taking a close look at that failure and saying, okay, so how am I able to take this shot from 10 feet away, but I'm not able to make the shot from 12 feet away? What's going on there? So you push yourself, and then when you get comfortable and you're able to make the shot from 12 feet away, then you go to 14 feet away. You try a new angle,
Yeah.
and you're always pushing yourself to fail. And the message that we tell that kids get when they hear that their talents are just gifts that they have, are what they're saying is, you've got this thing you're really good at. Don't mess with it. Like it's what it is. Why would you want to take risks and do something that you can't do? If someone's saying that you kind of were lucky to be born with this thing that you can do, and you're already being celebrated for it. So a lot of times we actually, in our culture, we take kids who are doing real well up to a certain point, and we start sending them the wrong message, and they start to become kind of stunted in their growth. They don't actually get the message that they need to keep pushing themselves to do even better, because they are being kind of put on a stage, sometimes literally put on a stage for celebrating for this kind of magic, gifted quality that they already have, and why would they want to mess with that?
Yeah, that's interesting. When you tell a kid, hey, you're so, when a kid performs well, you can look at him and say, hey, man, I can tell that you put a lot of work into that. I can tell that's a lot of time and effort and a lot of failure and fixing that you've done to acquire those skills. Or you can turn to that kid and you can say, man, you have got magic, a special gift. And now that kid is kind of, the onus is on him to sit there and say, okay, well, I better not ever do anything that could prove that I don't have that talent that you're saying that I have. And so they shy away from any challenges. Uh, they shy away from competing against someone that could beat them, because now it's, hey, if I lose, that means that's a permanent evaluation of me that I have failed. If I take this IQ test and it says that I am not that smart, well, now I have to live with that label the rest of my life. Whereas someone who looked at it more in a growth mindset way would see it as, okay, well, now I know what I need to work on and improve. Do you see that at all?
That's absolutely right. You're saying it perfectly. And for anyone who's listening, who may be shaking their head because it just doesn't sound right, because they've heard it, they've heard all this stuff talked about, the other way, and they're like, no, that's not what my teacher told me. Let me tell you, these are not ideas we have. This is proven science. This is solid science. There's a psychologist named Carol Dweck, who I know you know that is because you just used the term growth mindset. That's one of her terms. And she did an experiment that you were probably just either consciously or unconsciously describing, because she actually took a group of seventh graders, big group of seventh graders, and she gave them some puzzles that were on purpose. They were real easy. She wanted in the initial phase of this research, for everyone to do well and to feel like, oh yeah, I'm good at this puzzle. And then she divided them up into two different groups, and she gave two different message to each group. To the first group, she said, "You guys did really well in those puzzles, and you should feel great about that. And let me just tell you that the reason that you did well in those puzzles is that you were born with this great puzzle intelligence. Not everyone's born with it. You guys were born with it. You have this innate puzzle intelligence, and you should feel really great about that. You're kind of these gifted kids, and congratulations." And then she went to the other classroom and she said, "So listen, you guys did really well with these puzzles, and the reason that you did well in puzzles, in our research, we figured out that the reason people are able to do well in these puzzles is that you have a set of skills that you've developed over all the time you've been alive, at home and school and doing all the things you do, that have come together and made you really good at these puzzles, and you've worked hard for it too, because you're in school and you work hard and you do your homework and you do your reading, and that's something you've earned, that skill. So you should feel really good about that." And then they asked each group. They said, "We're going to give you some more puzzles now, and we're going to give you a choice. You can choose. You can choose to have the same kind of puzzle, like the same difficulty level, or if you want, you can choose some even harder puzzles." And not surprisingly, the kids who had been told that their ability to do well at that first level of puzzle was innate, was something that they just kind of had in them, almost all those kids wanted to stay at the same level. They didn't want to try another level puzzle. They just wanted to keep having that same feeling of doing well at something they were already good at.
Yeah.
And just kind of, they didn't. Why would they take a risk doing something that they weren't good at? And all the kids who had this idea that the whole reason they were good at puzzles was because they'd worked hard and they pushed themselves to get better and better at stuff. A huge percentage of those kids opted for the more difficult puzzles, and then she tracked those kids actually for years, and she saw that the kids who had chosen the harder puzzles ended up doing better at school, and there's this kind of cycle that feeds itself of trying harder, of actually trying so hard that you're failing, of having such high expectations that you're all the time you're seeing you're bumping into stuff that you can't do, and then going to your teacher or your mom or your dad or whoever it is and saying, why can't I do this? I was good at this equation in math. Why can't I figure out, I was good at algebra. Why can't I figure out calculus? And you work on that, and then you get calculus, and then you move on to advanced calculus. It never stops. And the funny thing about all this is, to me, you look at the life of someone like Michael Jordan, maybe arguably the best basketball player that ever lived. I might be dating myself a little bit here because he's my generation. I know there's some great new players. Some people would say are now the best, but whatever. He was great because he's a legend. And you look at his life, and Jordan was famous for, he hated to lose, and he worked harder than anyone else in the NBA at the time. He worked harder than anyone else in college level ball before that, and he was great. He was a marvel. And what people didn't understand, one thing that people would say all the time is, well, you're already so great. Why would you have to keep, like, you've already won all these championships. Why would you have to show up at practice extra early, every day? You're already the best. Why would you do that? And the people who get to that level, it's woven into the fiber of their lives that they're never going to stop, ever. They're never going to be satisfied. Their whole thing is they get satisfaction from pushing themselves harder. And even when you get to be the best of the best of the best, you only do that. You only get there after you spent years and years and years and years pushing yourself to be harder and never really being satisfied. And the satisfaction you get is from that feeling of pushing yourself. So that's why we look at these high achievers, and you never kind of get the sense that they're just going to kind of rest on their laurels or their current ability, and it's often kind of puzzling because it's like, wow, you're already kicking everyone else's butt. Why would you need to even work harder and get better? But working harder and pushing themselves is just who they are. It's what they've become over time.
That's awesome that you say that, and it goes right back to your idea that you talk about in the book, that greatness is not a thing, it's a process. And these guys find ways to fall in love with that process, and they never arrive. They never say, okay, now I'm great, I've earned this thing. Instead, they sit there and they say, hey, I love this process. And the process is what greatness is. It's not a thing, it's a process. Now, earlier you alluded to the science of it. Can you kind of talk to us about the science of our genes, our DNA, how they limit us, or how they don't limit us, and kind of give us that. I think there's always this idea that our genes are our destiny. That you were born, and depending on who your parents were, decides what you're going to be good at and what you're not going to be good at, and that some people are born with genes that just aren't going to be useful for a large number of things. Will you speak to that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And as you know, I actually start the book with this because I feel like I can't. It's hard for me to even get to some of the ideas that you and I have already talked about without just kind of laying out this idea of genes first. So if you pick up the book, you're for better or worse, you're going to see this stuff in the first and second chapter. What we learned about genes is that genes, we learned kind of this Mendelian idea of genes that, centuries ago, Gregor Mendel took these flowers, and he took the flowers with the long plants with the long stems and the certain shaped leaves, and he would marry them with, breed them with a plant that had one slightly different trait, and he would come up with this new trait, and he did kind of this chart, and he showed how, well, if you have this gene, it's going to lead to the bigger leaf, and if you have this other gene, if you have this recessive gene and the other recessive gene, it's going to lead to this different color flower or whatever. And that was the start of this understanding of genes as being these little tiny kind of capsules of instructions of how our traits are going to be. So, when you and I were brought up, we were brought up to think that we have genes that are going to tell us, what our eye color is, and genes that are going to kind of instruct our body about how tall to get and stuff like that. And that is just a fundamental misunderstanding of what genes are. Now, it's of course true that we all have genes, and that everything that we are is built by our genes. Genes do have instructions that relay this information of how amino acids should build proteins, and then proteins assemble in all these different configurations to become everything that we are. They build our brains, they build the connections in our brains, they build all the hormones in our blood, they build our muscles. Everything is proteins, and all those proteins are built with instructions from our genes. But here's the key thing. You don't have a gene inside you that if we could decode it, says blue eyes. Go build these blue eyes. What you have is a machine. The genes are so much more interesting than that. They're actually adaptable. Genes have these instructions. The genes that are kind of designated for your eye color, they have these instructions that actually that actually determine different outcomes depending on the environmental circumstances that they're in. So there's this kind of feedback loop. And the way to think about genes, instead of being these like little tiny books that have all the finished information in them of how tall you're going to be, what your eye color is, et cetera, how smart you're going to be, all that stuff. Think about, I think probably everyone listening, has seen a big audio control board, like from a music studio, with like this giant board that has 1,000 different knobs and switches on it, and there's a guy like turning the knobs and switches, and like turning up all the mics up and down and things like that. So that's what genes are. That's the better metaphor for genes. Genes actually get turned on and off and up and down all the time by what goes on in your life, and that started the microsecond that you were conceived. All the 9 months that you were in the womb, and then every second after you were born, and leading up to this moment in your life. And if you're 80 years old, it's still going on. Your genes are getting these signals that are coming to the cells from hormones that are being triggered by the amount of oxygen in the air, and how fast you're breathing, and whether you're walking up the stairs or running up the stairs, and whether you had a candy bar or a steak. Whether you're in a good mood or a bad mood, whether you're talking or not talking, whether you're feeling happy or you're feeling sad, all these different millions of different signals that are being kind of sent back as this feedback loop to all the cells in your body, and your genes are these switches that are getting turned on and off in response to all these environmental signals. So you could be sitting right next to your genetic twin. There could be a clone of you right next to you, and if you're eating a candy bar and he's eating a baked potato, you're gonna have genes in your body, even though you have exactly the same genes. You're gonna have different stuff happening in each of your genes and in your bodies as a direct result of you guys eating those different foods, and there's going to be a different outcome. And it starts to get pretty nuanced, and there are a lot of questions, I'm sure, in the minds of anyone listening is going, well, how do you explain this? How do you explain that? So, it does start to get a little more complicated than that. But it's once you have this basic understanding, and people may have seen the terms in newspapers by now, gene expression. That's really what I'm talking about. Gene expression is genes getting expressed, genes getting turned on and off. They might have also seen the term, which is very popular now, epigenetics, which can mean a lot of different things, but just in the most kind of fundamental, essential way, it's this basic idea that genes do interact and are motivated by their environment. So I know this is a very long-winded answer, but that's the core idea of how everything ends up being developmental, because there is no actual data in your genes for specific traits, like whether you're going to be musical or whether you're going to be 6'5" or 6'7". All these things are actually determined by this interaction that happens in your life, in your particular life, between your genes and your environment.
So That is really interesting to think about. Now, let me ask you a little clarity here. Are you saying that our eye color, that our bodies, I watched your TED talk on epigenetics and it was incredible. But that the idea or the truth that our bodies are by the minute uh, evaluating our surrounding and fine tuning ourselves so that we are best suited to be successful in our current environment. So, the idea of eye color, is it that babies are mainly born with blue eyes, but then over the course of that, I think the first 18 months, their eye color can change. Is it that the body is looking around and seeing, hey, what type of eye color is going to be best suited for the environment that I am born in, and then making adjustments on the fly? Is that what you're saying?
Well, that's a really simple way of putting what I'm saying. I don't want people to think that it's that elemental with something like eye color, like literally, you're born with these blue eyes, and then they're, the genes are kind of looking out and seeing what light is out there, and they're figuring, oh, you live in the northern hemisphere, you need darker color eyes. There's a lot of different things that go into that, and it gets really, really complicated because there are actually signals that were kind of baked into the wrapping around your DNA that is also referred to as epigenetics, that were influenced by the lives that your parents had.
Oh,
so
right.
it's not this starts to get kind of really kooky, actually, when you really get into it, but it's not the idea that you just stated is fundamentally correct, that the way genes have evolved over the billions of years is that they're and this is actually what the title of my book is all about, the genius in all of us. The genius in all of us is that we are designed to adapt. Human beings are successful as they are not because they're built with these brains that are meant to do all these different things, but because they're built with a genetic design and a neurological design that is meant to figure out what their environments are and can adapt and be the most successful beings in that different environment. So now, of course, a lot of this starts to get, there are different overlays in this. So something like eye color, obviously, I don't know what color your eyes are because I'm not looking at you, but mine are brown, and they've been brown since I was, 3 months old. A lot of these things start to get fixed. I'm actually the shortest member of my family by far. I have two brothers. They're both over 6 feet tall. My dad was 6 feet tall. I'm five. I was 5'9". Now I'm getting old and I'm shrinking. I think I'm 5'7". But I'm a couple inches shorter, and so something actually happened. There's this lore in my family that my mom was actually sick while I was in her womb, and that maybe that has something to do with my height. And that probably is a part of the story. But for whatever reason, something happened to me that I've always been on the shorter side, and I didn't grow to the same height as all these other members of my family. And it's not because I got these genes that if you could go, get inside there and decode the code of, all these different, GCA, whatever it is, in the DNA, it's not that you would see, oh, this guy's going to be 5'7". It doesn't say that. I have these particular genes, and things happen to me, to turn on these genetic switches, starting the moment I was conceived and on through being in the womb, etc. That in the end determined that I would be on the short side, or not. I'm not super short, but whatever. I don't want to offend people who are shorter than me, but that I would be shorter than a lot of other people in my family. And lo and behold, my son is probably going to be 6'2". He's very tall, and people are looking at us and going, "How did that happen?" Well, And you know, and the funny thing about height is we have this idea that's connected to this idea that genes have, you know, this innate instruction. So we say, oh well, so the Mexican people have these genetically, you know, have shortness in their genes because by and large, you look at just, you know, the whole of Mexican people, and they're much shorter than, say, other cultures, Scandinavian people, for example. Well, you look at history and you look at at how you can actually see how over hundreds and thousands of years, different cultures get shorter and taller, and it's a reaction, of course, to the resources in their world, you know, to the weather they're living in, and to their lifestyles, and of course to the nutrition that's available to them. And so this whole idea of short and tall genes is actually one of the great myths in all of this.
Huh. Now, in your book, you talk about you refer to a study that somebody did of Japanese Americans, Japanese people who were living in America, and their height compared to Japanese people living in Japan, and you found that the Japanese, or the research that you cited found that the Japanese Americans were much taller than the ones that were living in Japan, and it was most likely because they had better access to food and other outside resources. Now,
exactly right. Exactly right. That they did these experiments, which again, the funny thing about, the interesting thing about this way of thinking, of understanding genes and talent and intelligence and abilities and all that, is that once you understand the basic idea, you start seeing every bit of science everywhere fit perfectly into it, like it's a massive jigsaw puzzle, and all of a sudden it all just makes sense. All the different data, all the different studies, they all just kind of tell you different pieces and chapters of this same giant, big, wonderful story about the importance of thinking about things as development, as genes interacting with the environment, not genes just kind of determining who each of us is going to be as individuals.
Now, in the book, you talk about nature versus nurture, and that whole idea, and make the statement that nature versus nurture is probably not the best way to look at it, but instead that we should look at it as nature and nurture. Can you explain that?
Exactly. Yeah. It's an extension of what we've already been talking about. So if you know, the idea of nature versus nurture is, and I just saw a good friend of mine go on Facebook and said, "Hey, what do you guys think? Is it nature or is it nurture?" And everyone started saying, "Well, I think it's a little bit of both." And I tried to be polite about it. But I was like, you know, I read a whole book about this, and let me try to sum it up. But so yeah. So nature used to nature. In the nomenclature of nature versus nurture, the idea is, well, is it innate, is it inborn, or is it due to just your you know, to your life? And the answer is, it really is this really interesting combination of the two. So it's better to think about it as nature, you know, times nurture or plus nurture, or whatever, you know, whatever, however you want to put the words together. But it's that you cannot distinguish one from the other. And it's important for people to understand that I am not in any way implying that we all have exactly the same genes or potential, or, you know, or anything like that. I'm not saying that with a little bit more hard work that I could have been the best basketball player that ever lived. I know we're all different beings, but what people need to understand is that our differences, yes, they are heavily influenced by the different genetics that we have, but you can't look at a person's DNA and say this person is going to be great at something or not great at something, really poor at something, really unsuccessful, really successful. It's and if you had, as I started to say before, is a thought experiment. If you thought of two people having exactly the same DNA, which, you know, do more or less, we have that with identical twins. But if you thought about people like being more like clones, if you were able to get, say, the DNA of Einstein and clone him and have him raised in an entirely different environment from the moment he was conceived, from the one that the original Einstein was raised in. There is very little that you could say for sure about what that person would be like. You could say that he's going to be a man, that's for sure. There would be certain physical characteristics, undoubtedly, that turned out to that he would resemble the original Einstein. But you couldn't say anything else. You couldn't say that he's going to be super smart. You couldn't say that he's going to be great at physics. You couldn't say that he's going to have crazy white hair that sticks up. There's almost everything about how we think about who we are and how we identify ourselves in our lives really is the product of this very, very complex and ongoing interaction between nature and nurture, and that's what makes life so interesting. And that's why when we talk about potential, the most important thing to know about potential is you don't know what your potential is. You never know what your potential is. You know what your potential is in something about a half a second before you are going to die, because that's the end of your life, and you know that you've gone your whole life trying to be a good, great basketball player or painter or whatever it is, and you got to a certain point, and that's as far as you got. You never know before that what you're capable of achieving if you have the right time and circumstances and attitudes and all the other resources.
And you're talking about a clone of Einstein and what that person would look like and behave like. And in your book, you refer to in 2002, Texas A&M, they cloned a cat. The cat's name was Rainbow, and the clone is a genetic identical clone was named Cece, and they cloned that cat. And tell us about kind of how the cats, how they were different.
Yeah. This is funny because, it always makes me laugh because I gave one of my TED Talks I did in San Francisco, and it happened to be in this science theater and like a kind of planetarium-like theater, and the screen must have been 80 feet high, and so we were putting these slides up, and just these like skyscraper-like height slides, and I did a picture of these cats, and it was just kind of frightening to look at these cats that were like 80 feet tall. Everyone was like, "Whoa, that's a little oppressive." But yeah, so they were doing these cloning experiments, and this woman volunteered her cat because a lot of people love their pets, and she was thinking, all right, well, someday my cat's going to die, and it would be great to have a younger version of the same cat. And countless pet owners have had that thought before, and I'm sure at some point, if it's not already happening, there'll be lots of pet clones out there. But a funny thing happened. They cloned this cat, and they actually named the clone CC, which stood for carbon copy. And they thought, well, it's going to look the same and all that. And you look at a picture of this cat, and they're just entirely different cats. They one is kind of heavy set, one is not, one has different patches on its fur, and you would never in a million years think that this is the same. I mean, they're both cats, obviously, and you might believe that one is related to the other. You would never guess that they have the same DNA. It flies in the face of the whole concept that we all have in our heads of cloning. So what happened there? Well, what happened was what I've already described in a bunch of different ways. That they had the same DNA, but the DNA only goes so far. The DNA, sends out these signals to put these amino acids together and form proteins. But all these signals are actually influenced by what's going on in the environment. And the clones, when the clone was when Cece was conceived, and was just a handful of cells, her environment was very different from what we don't call her mom, but the parent clone, the original cat Rainbow, that cat's environment. Obviously, it was years before. It was inside another cat. It was a different thing. And so it's when you think about it that way, it's not surprising at all that there's going to be all sorts of different traits that result, even though they have exactly the same DNA, and that's really it's great to look at these two pictures in the book because it's you just kind of visually, some ideas can just be more powerful visually. You just kind of immediately understand that clones are not what we think of them as being. Their clones are it's a factual, literal understanding that they're going to have the same DNA, but it does not mean that they're going to be the same being in any way. That they're even going to look. That's just kind of a fast.
Let's take a quick break just to download some of this. It's a tough concept to think about, that maybe our DNA is not our destiny. It doesn't have to be who we are and who we become, and that can be tough to think about, and it can be hard. And I think oftentimes there's a lot of pushback to that idea because it's easy to take solace in the idea that I've done all that I can do, and it just isn't in the cards for me. I was the best athlete that I could have been, or I am currently the best athlete that is possible for me to ever become. You can sit back on that. And in previous podcasts, we've been exploring this idea of how much meat is left on the bone. There was an athlete who tore his ACL and came back 57 days later, and it's all because him and his dad refused to just accept it. Instead of saying, well, instead of just throwing their hands up and saying, well, there's nothing that can be done, they looked at it and they said, well, let's pretend that something can be done. What could we do? And it's kind of the same thing here with this topic. It's this idea that it's easy to sit back and look at your own capabilities and say, yep, that's all I've got. That was the best I could have been, or that's the best that I can be. And to throw your hands up and say, the reason why I'm not where I want to be isn't my fault. It's the fault of my genetics or luck or circumstance or whatever. And so in this topic, it's interesting and maybe tough to sometimes think about, hey, maybe it's on me. Now, the second side of that is something that is really beautiful and amazing, and something that inspires me as a coach, is this idea that talent is more about development and less about being born with some sort of magic, some sort of luck that puts you head and shoulders above everybody else. That's kind of a really cool concept, and it's something that I think is really amazing and inspiring to me as a coach. I remember sitting at a table with some coaches, and we were all talking. One of the coaches said, yeah, right now my team is very average, but someday, he goes, I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing, and someday some great athletes are going to walk through that door, and then I'm going to have a chance to be really, really good. And I just thought, man, I don't believe that, and I don't coach that way, and it doesn't sit well with me, this idea that the state champion every year is just a coach and a team that just somehow hit the lottery. They just rolled 777 on the slot machine. Instead, I want to believe those guys at the top of the game are the ones that have put the work in. A group of kids that have really let themselves be coached, let themselves be developed, that it started and worked really hard. And now this is the culmination of years and years of hard work, instead of this idea that this is the culmination of just a bunch of kids who were born genetically ahead of everybody else, just getting their destiny, that fate has chosen them to be great. I like, in his book, he talks about this idea. In David Shenk's book, he talks about this idea that talent is not like striking gold or hitting oil. That talent is more like an ever-present resource, like solar power, that just has to be harvested. The sun is always there, and we can get power from it, but we have to set some things up the right way so that talent can be harvested. And I thought that was an interesting way of looking at talent and understanding that. And so whatever the truth is, either the truth is that, people are just born with these gifts and they just are achieving their destiny, or maybe the truth is that the people who are great have put in the most work. and have been developed the most. Whatever the truth is, though, I know that for me as a coach, I'm always going to look at it as that success and failure is my fault, and what can I do to improve it? What can I do to develop these kids more? I'm never going to, as a coach, just throw my hands up and say, well, I just don't have good enough athletes. These kids just aren't good enough. Instead, I want to look at those kids and say, how can I do a better job of developing them? How can I dedicate myself more? How can I get them to dedicate themselves to refining their craft and putting the work in? And that's the way that I choose to look at coaching. And maybe I'm totally wrong. Maybe the evidence is skewed. I don't know. But regardless of the evidence, I'm going to coach. I'm going to coach. Like, their development depends 100% on me, and I hope that they play. The players work, they play like the team's success is 100% dependent on them. And if we all look at it as, hey, it's all up to me. If everyone looks at it as in, hey, it's all up to me, well, then I think great things can really be achieved. All right, now we're going to go right back to David, and he's going to continue on. He's going to touch on this same topic that I just spoke on.
Concept.
That is fascinating. And so, we've talked about neuroplasticity, how your brain is always developing, that IQ is not fixed, but it is something that is always growing or improving depending on your behavior. You talked about how us as human beings, our bodies are constantly adjusting and changing our genes via our epigenome and all these things that just show that our bodies are just this incredible adaptive machine that is always learning, always improving, even when we are not consciously doing it, but it's changing based on the demands that we put on it. With all that in the backdrop, how does that affect you as a parent?
Yeah, so great question, because then you start trying to ask questions with that kind of basic new understanding. Well, how does this impact how I think about what I'm capable of and what my child is capable of, what my students are capable of? And it raises all sorts of interesting questions. There are a lot of people. I'm going to take a little tangent here that is a different way of answering the question, and let you know that there are a lot of people that hear this, and when they first hear it, it's shocking and it's very disturbing, because a lot of people are very, very comfortable and comforted by the idea that they have all these limits that are kind of baked into them, that there's nothing they can do about it. There's just a lot of people I've dealt with. People have gotten almost violently angry at me at book, reading things like that, because they're just like, don't you understand? There's no way I can be a great musician. I tried it and I tried it and I tried it, and I know my limits, and that's those are my innate limits, and it upsets them to think that they might have been able to do something different, or have been taught differently, or even still might be able to put more into it, or kind of figure out what their limitations are and get better. And my answer to that is I'm telling you that story because it starts to go to how I think about how this stuff affects my own life, and how I try to think about it as a parent. And that is, it doesn't mean that just because all this stuff is developmental that we really have control over it. When you think about all the different things in your life that have come to you, not through DNA biological inheritance, but have just come to you inherited in other ways. You were born with the parents you were born with. There's nothing you could do about that. They were certain types of people. They had certain resources. You lived in a house on a block in a certain city. You didn't make any of those choices. You ate certain foods. Your parents made some of those choices, but all those choices that kind of you think of them having made for you, even they didn't make a lot of those choices. They lived in a certain time and place, and they were raised in a certain place, and they were taught certain things about foods, and they were led in a certain economic path, and they had certain luck and lack of luck in their lives, and they had certain teachers. So we all live in this really complicated world where there are all these influences that that help shape who we are and who we become, and our identity, our sense of ourselves, that we don't really have any control over. And so that's one point to make, and I think people should be comforted by that. Actually, I know I am. I know that I am a certain kind of person, and although I have ideals about who I want to be, and I constantly do push myself in certain directions, I'm okay with the idea that I'm not necessarily ever going to get to a certain place, and that I had certain advantages and disadvantages that were kind of built into my world by the resources and the circumstances that I was born into and that I developed into, that I didn't necessarily, many of the things, those things I didn't necessarily choose. So that's kind of a second thought, and just one more thought that I want to sneak in, and then I'd love to hear what you have to say about this, if we have time. It's important that I think it's also important that the people realize, whether it's as parents or just thinking about their own potential, that to the extent that a lot of these things are in our control, to the extent that we decide that we want to be, we do want to be a great violinist, or we do want to be we do want to, whatever it takes to become a great soccer player or what have you. To become truly great at something is, there's a reason that you don't see it too often. It's an extraordinary thing that requires an absolutely insane amount of time and effort, and a combination of things that that very few of us end up having, and that, frankly, I think very few of us would want to have. The lives that I've studied of actually absolutely extraordinary performers and achievers in different domains, they are amazing to witness, and it's almost like magic to see some of these people play their instruments and and conduct their athletic lives in the field and so forth. But you also, as you get to know their lives, you realize, wow, these people, they made a lot of sacrifices in their lives. That guy is the best basketball player who ever lived. He didn't have normal relationships with people. He didn't go out and see movies. There's a great story about Ted Williams and in his childhood, and how this guy decided very early on, for some crazy reason, that he wanted to be the best hitter that ever lived. And he spent, and it is not an exaggeration, every single waking moment trying to be the best hitter that ever lived. He would cover up. He wouldn't do any other sports. He would get out of school if he could. He would literally cover up his different eyes with patches so that he could train one eye to be sharper, by kind of fending on its own for a while. He was quite poor. He would go to this baseball park around the corner from his home, and he would take the little lunch money that he had and skip lunch and use the money to pay kids to shag balls for him, so that he wouldn't have to run into the outfield. He would just have these kids, running back and giving him balls and throwing balls at him, so that he could just keep hitting, and he could have an hour of practice for him would be super efficient. And there's a great story. Can I take another minute to tell another Ted Williams story?
Please do. It's
right.
Yeah.
There's a fantastic story about, I'm going to forget some of the details, but when Ted Williams was in the minor leagues, I believe it was. I think it was the San Diego Padres. Probably getting that wrong, but it was a minor league team, and I think it was in San Diego. And the minor leagues is a big deal. Not many people get to the minor leagues. It was, he was already a success of sorts, and he was being paid. It was a job. It was a profession. And there was a whole structure to it. There was a team, and they had practice, and the coach noticed that Williams would gather all the balls. They would destroy these balls in practice. They would hit them so many times that the hide, the covering would be coming off, and the stitching would be coming off the balls. They were basically useless. but the coach would notice that that Ted Williams at the end of practice would run around and pick up all these balls that had been half destroyed. And he, after a month or so, he asked him, "What are you doing with all those balls? Are you making a little money on the side by selling them to kids or something?" He said, "Oh, no. After practice, I go to my little field near my home, and I pay some kids, and we do some more practice. we should all like do what I've been doing when I made the team." And the coach was like, "Okay, he's lying. There's no human being on earth who would practice all day on a professional level, and then when practice ended, go and practice some more. That's crazy. I'm already working these players as hard as a coach can work them." So he actually followed him home one day, and he witnessed firsthand, and this is how we know the story, that Ted Williams is not lying. Even as a professional baseball player, he was practicing just at this insane level. And lo and behold, Ted Williams, as probably everyone listening knows, did become the best hitter that ever lived to this day, and just would do these remarkable things. And people, he could hit so well, and that people would swear that he had some sort of gift of eyesight, that he could slow things down, that he could see things that people just weren't, that even other professional ball players couldn't see. And in a sense that was true, but it was true because of this absolutely insane level of perseverance and dedication that was not even human. It was just like, it was almost like he was another animal in terms of how dedicated he was, because even in the realm of very accomplished professional major league players, he stood out as being this super performer, and there was a reason for it, and the reason was every day that he had spent in his life in that certain way.
I have a picture that's behind me on the podcast. It says it's by John Kavanaugh. He's the coach of MMA fighter Conor McGregor, but he said something. I'm just going to read it to you here. He says, "If you want to be champion of the world, it's actually pretty simple. It just has to be your every waking moment." And that's pretty much exactly what you just said. And I, you're asking kind of my response to the whole thing and how I felt about the book and the ideas of, this idea that I could look back and say, man, if I would have known some more things, if I would have done some things differently, I could have been better. But at the same time, as a coach, I really find your book inspiring, and the whole idea that that there's so much that our bodies can change and that our brains can change. In the book you talk about how the brain physically changes. That the scientists have looked at people's brains before and after learning an instrument, and can see that the brain physically changes. And this constant growth
Right.
is something really inspiring to me. And you're telling the story of Ted Williams, and I'm just over here just hearing it and just being blown away by it, because I think there's something so beautiful about the loving of the process, the joy in working hard at something. And I'm sure that you felt it, when you were probably sitting down writing the book, and writing all the books that you've written. There's a point in there where you just are doing it, and you're just thinking, wow, this is something that I love. Like, I'm just loving this. And I know that I feel the same way when I, practice or learn and grow in things. And I see that same moment in the kids that I coach, this aha moment, this wow, I never thought that I'd be there yet, and I'm getting there, and this excitement of what they've accomplished, but also of how much more there is to learn and how much more there is to grow. Every week with the football players, I give them a card that tells them, hey, here's what your goal to learn this week. It gives them 4 things on there. Boom, boom, boom. For example, one of my kids, the goal was to set up your blocks. The other goal was to complete 90% of your passes on this drill in practice. And so they have those goals, and just the excitement that they have in, hey, I'm going to learn this skill. I'm going to learn this, and I'm going to perfect this behavior, and that joy. And that's the same thing that I'm sure Ted Williams was caught up in. And I'm sure you've seen that in your own kids, and I've seen that in mine. And I just want to thank you for that inspiring of the book, and that whole thing behind it is really just a really awesome idea. Now, let me ask you one more thing, and you kind of alluded to it a little bit, in that you don't know what's possible in somebody's potential until the very end. And so, in light of all these things, in light of the human potential that we have, do you feel like we are ever missing? We're not reaching our full potential because we are misunderstanding how our bodies work and change and adapt, how we as human beings grow. Do you feel like we're still leaving meat on the bone instead of, in that, I guess, in that little.
That's a great question. I really do. I see, there's really only one thing that I've excelled at in my life in any way, and that's writing. And it's because it's been my lifelong passion, and I have writing heroes the way other people have sports heroes, and and I wanted to write certain kinds of nonfiction books, and I do love the process. I also kind of hate it because it's very hard, but I think people who have their passions, they also know that feeling of love hate. You do get overwhelmed by it, and you get sick of it sometimes and stuff. But there is that drive to be better and to learn from your mistakes, and to always just kind of learn how to do it. So this is all a setup to tell you that I have published a bunch of books now. I'm really I've had some great success. I'm very humbled and fortunate, and so I've achieved some small notoriety, and so for a long time now I've been at the receiving end of young writers getting in touch with me. How do you publish a book? How do you write this well, whatever, and also just talking to people who were interested in writing but kind of gave up on it, or people will say to me just casually, "Oh yeah, I wanted to be a writer, but I didn't have the talent for it, or I just I couldn't do it." And I see a lot of people just in my own profession, or through my own professional lens, who I know are just they do love writing, and they do want to be better at it. They do love reading, and they love literature, and they love words, and they love the idea of being a published successful writer. But they just kind of got this idea at a certain point that they were only so good at it. Maybe they were kind of good at it, but they weren't great at it, and they just kind of accepted that, and went on and got a job at something else. And that's fine. I'm not judging them at all. Maybe a lot of them are doing a job that ends up being a lot more fun than writing, and also more lucrative. So I'm not judging them. It's not that I think that writing is better than anything else. But to me, when I see someone who has this made up their mind about themselves, that the thing they wanted to do well, they just weren't capable of, and they kind of figured that out, and they moved on in their life, that really makes me sad. And it does tell me that there's just all this potential that is just kind of sitting there. And we all make sacrifices, we all make decisions, we all have, at a certain point, we have economic pressures, and we have kids to raise, and there's all sorts of things that our lives turn out differently from what you might have dreamed, and that's okay. That's all great. That's life. Life should be full of compromises. That part is fine. But to see people give up on their dreams because they've become convinced that they never really had the chance is something that makes me sad, and I wish that people, I hope that more people will start to understand this different paradigm of talent and intelligence, and not to think that it's easy in any way, or that anyone can be, extraordinary at anything or anything like that, but that just fundamentally, if you decide you want to be great at something, and you dedicate your whole life to being, with no end point, to being better and better and better and better and better, and that process is something, as you said, that you fall in love with. You really have no idea how great you're going to become, and how influential you're going to become, and how what new things you're going to introduce into the universe as a result of just all that hard work. And in my own life, just to kind of put it in a couple other different ways, one thing that I've observed just over and over again is everything that I've worked on, every single thing that I've worked on, starts out just as complete crap. I know the sentences I write and the ideas I have and the books I start. It is just a mess. I'm decades into this now, and I never sit down and just start writing all these beautiful sentences that just go from one to another and then just turn out this, perfectly turned paragraph and then page and then chapter. It's nothing like that. It is really, really, really hard work. And I rewrite and I rewrite and I rewrite, and I spend literally years and years and years on just one book. And I'm never, ever satisfied. And finally, someone just kind of puts a gun to my head and says, all right, book's done. You've got to move on. That's how it works for me. But I get to see. So, once you've been through that cycle a couple of times, you start to realize that feeling that you have at the beginning of the process, it starts to become familiar, and you realize that if you have the faith that this is something you want to do, and that if you have the faith that if you stick with it for long enough, it is going to become something worthwhile, then and it's worth sticking with, even through slogging through all the stuff that seems like, boy, this is no good and it's never going to be good. It's going to be good, if you stick with it. And I recently had a great conversation with my daughter, who is in college, and she's thinking about starting a podcast herself, and she had a great idea for it. I'm not going to tell anyone because I don't want anyone to steal it. It's a really clever idea she had about how to do a podcast I don't think anyone's done before. But of course she doesn't know how to podcast. She doesn't know anything about it. She just got the idea because she likes listening to podcasts. And I said, Lucy, I'm not going to be overbearing about this. I'm not going to impose, and like get all in your face about how to do it because it's your thing. But I just want to say one thing. And that I just want to tell you that I guarantee you that if you do it, when you start, you're going to feel like a fake and a phony, and there's going to be so many times in the beginning and for a long time where you're just like, why am I doing this? I'm not good at it. It's not, it's not like any of these other great podcasts that I'm hearing that I admire. It's just, they're great and I'm not great. It's the feeling you're going to have for a long time. But if you like doing it and you want to get better at it, and you stick with it over a long period of time, it is going to feel like, wow, I just learned something and now I'm a little better. And then, and I know that that's going to happen to you because it still happens to me, and I'm a lot older than you, and I've been doing what I do for a long, long time, and I still have that feeling. So I think she heard it, and I hope she kind of, we'll have to see.
Man, that is really good advice. Just to say, and I tell my players the same thing. I tell my students the same thing, hey, it's going to be hard and it's going to be a struggle and you're going to feel like a fake and a phony. That's awesome advice. And man, it is crazy to hear, and I tell my students this all the time, I'm an English teacher, and I tell my students this all the time that, you are a best-selling author, a national best-selling author. You've written multiple books, and what you write is amazing. But it doesn't start out that way. It starts out as, in your words, absolute crap. And my kids often think, hey, they think either one or two things. They think I'm not good enough, and so they start it and then they crumple it up and they throw it away, or they think, yeah, it's great. What I wrote is perfect. And I turn around and
Yeah.
I say, hey, you're not done. Make it better. And they say, no, coach, it's already the best. No. I don't care what level it's at now. Let's make it better. And so it's funny
Yeah.
now because
Yeah.
my kids will parrot me. The kid next to him will say, all right, coach, I'm done. And the kid next to him will say, no, dude, make it better. And
That's funny.
but it's this whole idea of, hey, it's just greatness is not a thing. It's a process. Make it better. And you're going to start at zero, and it's going to be bad at first, and it's going to be a struggle, and you're going to have to rewrite it, and it's you're going to have to, but jump on that ship, board that ship, and ride that wave, and enjoy that process. And man, it's been incredible talking to you. All right, well, David, hey, thank you so much for joining us on the Football Journey podcast. How can we, what we want to learn more? Where can we go? What do we, we can go see your TED Talks. Talk to us a little bit about all of that.
Sure. Okay. Self boosting time. So yeah, I've given a couple different TED Talks. You can find everything you always wanted to know about me, and a lot that you don't want to know about me, at my website, davidshenk.com, and it's davidshenk.com. And I've got my books there and my bio and links to my TED Talks and things like that. And you can actually email me directly from that site. I hope people will read this book. I think they'll find it interesting. The book is as I hope you've experienced, Eric. My whole thing about writing is clarity and trying to make sure I don't lose. If they read the first sentence, I want to keep them going to the end. So I try to tell good stories, and I try to make sure that all the science and ideas are just extra clear, and people never feel confused or lost or kind of left behind. So if you're interested in this subject, I hope you'll pick it up and read it through, and you'll probably start developing questions and start disagreeing with me at certain points. But then if you stick with it, hopefully I'll have addressed most of those concerns by the time you get to the end of the book.
Yeah, it is an incredible book, and I've read it. I've read it multiple times. I have it. I have a hard copy, but I also listen to it on audio. I've done that a couple times too, and man, it is. It's just an incredible thing, and incredible thoughts and ideas, and it's super clear. And I would suggest that any parent, any coach, any teacher should read that book. It changes the way that you look at the kids that you coach, the kids that you teach, and your own kids. And it's really an incredible thing, and it changes the way you look at yourself. And so, awesome book, David. Thank you so much for coming on, man. It was really insightful, and I really appreciated it.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me. It's great talking to you, and I'm really glad the book has resonated with you. So let's stay in touch.
You have been listening to the A Football Journey podcast. This podcast is powered by A Football Journey. A Football Journey is a hands-on character curriculum that is used by coaches all over the country. Coaches use it with their players. Every player in the program gets A Football Journey manual, and a coach walks the player through each lesson, one lesson a week, 26 lessons over the year. A Football Journey comes in 4 different volumes, and so each year a player is receiving a new volume, never hearing the same lessons twice. For more information on this, you can go to afootballjourney.com. That's afootballjourney.com. You can also contact me on Twitter. My name is Derrick Ware, and it's spelled D-A-R-R-I-C-K, last name W-A-R-E. You can find me on Twitter. You can also email me at derrickware@gmail.com. And lastly, look for a follow-up to this interview. There are so many things to discuss, and so we're going to do a little post show where I just talk about, and we just talk about some things that David Shenk has said, and it's been incredible, and it's given us a lot to think about.